Well, would you look at that? More Columns. Who would have thunk it? This time it's Columns on PC Engine, a 1991 game only available in Japan or wherever imports are sold. I guess. I suppose to make a long story short, if you enjoy Columns, just stick with the Sega version since they're much more easily accessible, but for the sake of this video, we'll dive deeper into Columns for PC Engine, which is not a bad conversion of the game, but not one that stands out on any technical merit. Now for those who need a primer, Columns is a puzzle game where jewels would fall from the sky in columns of 3, and you have to clear them from the well by matching 3 of a kind in either a vertical column, a horizontal row, or a diagonal line. Your main means of control, besides moving the column of jewels, is shifting the order in which the jewels are stacked. There's no rotating bits for anything like that. Everything falls in columns of 3. The first couple of stages will give you hints on how to play, but you could skip ahead if you desire and go for a higher challenge. You cycle the jewel order in your columns and you work with that. It's a fairly simple premise with some simplistic controls, but one that ramps up in the challenge level rather quickly due to the fluctuating speed and things of that nature. Performing chains and massive clearings is often key to survival in Columns, and can sometimes happen by accident unless you're really good, in which case you'll plan for said clearings. There are a couple of modes of play. Aside from the usual arcade mode, there's also a practice mode, which is basically the original mode from the Genesis port, a more laid-back version of Columns with options for starting level, difficulty setting, and a choice of 3 music tracks, as well as 2 versus modes that I can't play at the moment, but basically one has stones while the other freezes. Sorry folks, that's all I got. Columns on PC Engine plays about as well as Columns on the Sega Genesis, which is good because that means you're getting a functionally competent version of Columns on this foreign console, and a functionally competent version of Columns means everything works the way it's supposed to. The game runs at roughly the same speed, acts about the same way, and controls just as well. Judging this game on its own merits is impossible because this feels like a carbon copy of that Sega version. Not that it's a bad thing, because Columns had a simple premise that's addictively challenging the longer you play. Unlike Tetris, especially in its early days, Columns and its various ports doesn't deviate from the source material all that much. Whether you're talking about the arcade original Columns, or the 16-bit iterations, or even the 8-bit ones. You play one version of Columns and you could jump into another one without much trouble or adjustment, since it's all the same thing. Now, once you start diving into stuff like Columns 3, or Super Columns, or Columns Crowns, and things of that nature, that's a different story, but we're not touching those yet. Actually, we already did Super Columns, didn't we? Anyways, never mind. The PC Engine version of Columns looks fairly approximate to the Genesis version, at least in terms of the layouts and details and things of that nature. In some ways, barring some really minor differences in terms of slight color shifts and a bit of detail here and there, both could easily be dead ringers for each other. And while some more astute folks might point out some deeper differences that I might be overlooking, really, who gives a shit? You have a board, you have jewels, it runs well, it looks halfway decent for what it is, it's perfectly fine. This feels no different than the other version, and, for me that's good enough, so I don't know what else to tell you. Sound, on the other hand, is a bit of a mixed bag. To put it more straightforward, it's the same musical bits and sound effects as in the Sega versions, except a little more tinny sounding and weak. The tunes themselves are alright, even if they're not high on my list of ancient chiptunes, but they fit the overall theme of the game, I suppose. And the sound effects are just okay, but again, very weak sounding in general. I don't know, when you're used to the Genesis version, you go to something like this and it doesn't sound as good. But then again, that could be just a matter of preference, But, whatever. Overall, it's Columns on PC Engine, and this is a fine enough version of a classic Sega puzzle game as you'll ever find on the wild. So if you're into importing stuff and you want another puzzle game to add to the PCE, TurboGrafx, whatever pile, then you could do no wrong with Columns. For everyone else, however, your stock Columns game on Sega Genesis, Game Gear, Master System, or whatever Sega compilation or digital service you could find out there will suit you just fine. There's nothing really special about this particular version of Columns, other than it's on a non-Sega system, and that's about it. But hey, it's a fun game at least, so no real complaints in that regard.